Today we have a few different versions of a budget PC build that we're looking at, and every time we do budget PC builds, we have commenters complain that we choose cases that are actually good and cost $50 or $60, which is apparently too much for a budget PC build. So, to sate the commenters, we have purchased this. This is the worst case we've ever intentionally purchased. It is the DIY PC Zonda O, and before that, this video is brought to you by the Gigabyte X299X Designare high-end motherboard. The Gigabyte X299X Designare runs Intel's X299 chipset for HEDT CPUs, but this board stands out most for its properly finned VRM heatsinks and cooling solution, and its focus on networking with dual 10 gigabit Ethernet alongside Wi-Fi 6 802.11ax support. Learn more at the link in the description below. This should be pretty fun today. This is another one of our PC builds. We don't do a ton of these, as stated in our last one, which was a 3950X high-end production PC build for video editing, things like that. As stated in that video, we don't do too many of these because we prefer to just test the individual parts and let you figure out what you want to buy for the build. And people always complain about PC builds because we choose things that are apparently sometimes too expensive, but there's a reason for that. And last time I explained it, it went over pretty well with everyone. The reason we choose the parts we do that you'll see in this build is because we've actually tested them and used them. You could always choose cheaper parts on Newegg. You could sort by lowest price and grab any AM4 motherboard, technically. Doesn't mean it'll work or work well or last, but you could do it. What we've done here, though, is we've chosen parts that we think will actually last for the life of the system, the usable life of the system while it's relevant, and we've put them together in a way that allowed us to also test all the components, plus the two different upgrade pathways we've chosen. So we have one version of this build, which I guess I should say the prices. It's a $371 base build with an Athlon 3000G and an RX 570 that's on sale and should probably remain on sale until they're gone. And then we have upgrade pathways. You could do about $30, get up to $400 and upgrade the cooler. You could go up to $500, at which point you should consider a CPU upgrade instead. But if you went up to $500, you could consider a 1650 Super with a 3000G and a Fractal Focus G case, which is a major case upgrade, and then also the cooler upgrade, also memory upgrade to 16 gigabytes instead of 8 gigabytes, so forth. So we've got all three of those variants tested today from bottom to top, and this will also allow us to answer another question, which is at what point does the 3000G begin to throttle the GPUs? Because we've got an RX 570, we have a GTX 1650 Super, and at the high end we have a 2080 Ti, which is just from our standardized test bench. Obviously, you should never pair that with a 3000G, but it lets us see what's the ceiling and frame rate for the games where we've tested it. So this will be unlike a lot of the builds that you likely see on a regular basis because we have extensive thermal testing, we've got power testing, game testing, and game testing with variations. So you can see if you want to build the base model, $370-ish DIY, not to be confused with DIY PC, the name of the case brand, but if you want a DIY build at 300 something bucks, where would your money best go for the different types of upgrades? We're looking at that today as well. So for what this is versus what this isn't, we think of this as kind of a build guideline, not necessarily a template. You could follow it part for part and it would all work. And it's all stuff we've tested and for the most part think is fine. But what we're doing here, it's a bit different, is we're going through the parts we chose after testing it, and we're going to talk about what we would have done differently with the experience of building with these specific parts so that you could do a better one if you wanted to. So useful data is included for these builds to help you figure out the best upgrade paths, and then we'll also be talking about why we chose the parts we did, because we've used all of these in the lab extensively and think they're good enough for at least this build, if not builds in general, and it's all very carefully chosen. All right, so the builds. We've got a few of them. Through the $371 base build has a stock cooler. These are the differences I'm going to go through. Stock cooler, which is bad, but gets the job done, sort of, with the right case anyway. It has the worst case we've ever intentionally purchased, but one that actually warrants thermal testing in a separate review for the future. We have an RX 570, that's about $100 these days, on sale at least currently, and 8 gigabytes of 3000 megahertz 161818 memory. And parts for all of this stuff will be linked below. The $400 build moves to a cheap tower cooler, the Thermaltake Contact 12. It's not good, but it's a lot better than the stock cooler. It has a lot of issues with it. It's, however, in the good enough category for a $20-ish, $30 upgrade max. $500 moves to the Fractal Focus G case, which is significantly better build quality. Could use some help on fans, though. If you had extra budget for fans, it'd be worthwhile. And $500 also moves to a 1650 Super, and the build also has 16 gigabytes of 3200 megahertz memory for system RAM, So you increase the effective speed by 200 megahertz and the capacity by 2x, and then the GPU takes a big step up as well. Finally, we really think you should probably modify the $500 build to include a better CPU, and we have a separate video coming up on that too, where there's 2000 series AMD Ryzen parts for very cheap right now. Because the 3000G just at $500, it starts to feel kind of bad to buy. So wouldn't recommend that one, but we're testing it anyway to show you what happens if you upgrade everything else but the CPU, if you want to cheap out there. The motherboard is going to be the B450 Aorus M as well for all of these builds. Let's recap the parts before we get into testing. For the CPU, we used AMD's new Athlon 3000G, which we have reviewed, and we included in our best CPUs of 2019 roundup as the best dirt cheap budget option. The 3000G is a Zen 1 architecture chip, something that we confirmed separately with AMD after some initial confusion amongst media due to AMD's incorrect wording at some of the press events. And as such, it follows that Zen 1 performance behavior will apply to the 3000G. It's unlocked for overclocking, just like the 200GE was, and its ceiling is about 4 gigahertz, given that it's Zen 1. It is poorly binned, though. These are not good chips. That's why they're cheap. And at $50, you shouldn't expect too much. 4.0 is a good overclock on this. 3.9 might be more realistic, maybe even 3.8. But you'll need a motherboard that's at least capable of doing some basic overclocking. There's a lot of gains to be had, though, from an overclock. For the motherboard, we chose the Gigabyte B450 Aorus M, which is listed in Buildzoid's guide on our channel of the best motherboards for Ryzen in 2019. It was the cheapest one that he was willing to go down to. This is actually a good low-end motherboard that we do like and we have used. It's the cheapest board we're currently comfortable with recommending for something where you might overclock. It still has some basic OC features, although they're much harder to work with than higher-end boards, but they're good enough for a 3000G. We wouldn't recommend overclocking on this motherboard for higher-end AMD chips than what we're using today. It's perfectly fine, though, for a 2-core, 4-thread CPU that won't really put much strain on the VRM in a way that significantly heats up the board. You're still going to be fighting with BIOS, though. Either way, we chose this board specifically because it's not absolute garbage, and it gives you some upgrade headroom later. For example, you could pull the 3000G and drop an R5 3600 in here later if you find some more money in maybe a year or so, and that'd run perfectly fine under full stock settings. But it would also massively improve the system, so we like a good base platform that is upgradable. When going with cheap AMD parts, it's ideal to get a board that's good enough to support upgrades. If you look around online, AMD has had its Zen 1 and Zen Plus parts on fire sale for the last year or two, and Ryzen 3000 will likely eventually end up in that spot as well. Looking around, for example, the R5 1600 or 2600 are both in the $100-ish range, $140 range max these days, and those are great upgrade options. As for the cooler, we have two variants. For the dirt cheap build, we have the stock 3000G cooler. It's not good. It's in fact bad, but it is good enough with a sufficient case, and we'll have thermal testing for that later in the content. Our alternative was the Thermaltake Contact 12, one of the worst tower coolers you could get, but at $20 to $25, it's also one of the cheapest and still significantly better than the stock 3000G cooler. That's what matters in a dirt cheap build. We'll show thermal tests for this later as well in the content. Our problems with the Contact 12, though, include poor mounting mechanisms, which is why its cost is low, because it uses the AMD stock motherboard clips and 2 contact points to sort of hold it in place. The cooler requires excessive force to get the lever pushed over the anchor point, and removing the cooler later requires more caution than usual to ensure the CPU isn't ripped out of the PGA socket at a 45-degree angle, because that's what will happen with this cooler, unlike some of the others. That said, it is cheap, and it does work much better. We just advise trying to minimize how many times you mount or unmount the cooler. For the GPU, we have two options that are split between the 1650 Super and the RX 570. The 1650 Super is the newer of the cards and costs about $160, while the 4GB RX 570 was, at time of assembly, being dumped for $100 after rebate on Newegg. The 570 was a good card at launch and remains good for 1080p gaming, and at $100, it's still worth it for budget builds. The card was originally $180 to $200. As for the 1650 Super, it's got a performance advantage in some of the games tested today, making it potentially worthwhile. Finally, we arrive again to the case. Typically, this is where we'd use some $60 case that's actually kind of good, but people always complain that we're wasting money on good parts that can be reused for multiple builds in the future and reduce future expenditure and waste. So we decided to buy a piece of shit like our commenters wanted. We bought the DIY PC Zonda O, which coincidentally neither looks nor feels like a Zonda. It is, however, orange, sometimes, and that's good. It's also extremely lightweight, and not because it's made out of carbon fiber. Everything about the Zonda O with 2 Ds feels cheap, including the Be Gamer slogan on the side of the box, but it does have a GPU side intake fan, a front intake fan, and exhaust in the back, giving it some potential for maybe a kind of decent airflow pathway. We really think you'd be better off finding a used case at this price point, but we can't predict the used market. So while a used case might be good, this will always be not that. But it gets the job done, and that's what our goals were for this build. An upgrade pathway for this would be the Fractal Focus G case. We'll start off the thermal section with our cheapest variant of this build, using the plasticky DIY PC case and a stock Athlon 3000G cooler, a strange but cheap combination that keeps costs low. Starting off with the build using the DIY PC Zonda O, we use both the stock cooler that is provided with the 3000G and later also the cheap Thermaltake Contact 12, recorded CPU and GPU temperatures. Our testing is conducted in a highly controlled environment with ambient logged every second. This testing also uses thermal stress tests that load the CPU and GPU simultaneously, giving us a scenario comparable to a very heavy gaming workload. The testing methodology is similar to our critically acclaimed case reviews, except that we've left the GPU fan speeds to auto in this instance, intentionally as well. Typically, we'd control the GPU fan speeds, but we leave them alone for one-off PC builds like this, since that's how most users would interact with the system. This also allows us to see how it does when it self-regulates. For the CPU temperatures, the stock cooler test ran at an idle temperature of 10 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient, or about 31.5 degrees Celsius T-die, and the load temperature plotted at 82 degrees Celsius by the time it was nearing steady state. Keeping in mind that this is a scenario where the GPU is dumping heat into the case, we're looking at a benchmark that tests the total system's cooling performance and so is useful, especially in PC build guides. Putting the $20 to $25 Thermaltake cooler on it drastically improved the results for load temperature with an idle of 7.1 delta T over ambient, or about 28 degrees T-die, and a load temperature of about 69 degrees T-die at steady state. This is acceptable for a cheap PC. We'd advise a cooler upgrade, even if it's one of the cheaper ones on the market, like the Contact 12. We wouldn't typically consider the Contact, there's no T at the end of that, 12 to be worthwhile, but against the stock cooler for the 3000G, it really is a big difference. This will also help account for cases with poor airflow to some extent. Moving on to GPU temperatures, we saw actually good results, thanks in part to the lower power requirement of the card, and in large part to the side panel intake fan on the Zonda O. Side intake fans are uncommon these days, but are one of the most effective ways to cool a GPU. With the stock cooler on the 3000G, the GPU had an idle temperature of 26 degrees Celsius for GPU die, and a load temperature of 75. Fan RPM with the stock cooler, not plotted here, was 1820 RPM when left to self-regulate. With the Thermaltake cooler, we measured an idle temperature of 25 degrees Z and a load temperature of 74 degrees Celsius, about equivalent for the two coolers. The difference, though, is that the fans ramped up to 1940 with this configuration. This is also why we control GPU fan speed in standardized testing, but the point of this is more realism-focused than benchmark-focused. The fan ramp is because the GPU fans are pulling in some of the air radiating off of the cooler. There's still not enough pressure to exhaust the air fast enough from the case, so the video card ends up recirculating some of its own hot air. If you're worried about VRM thermals on a relatively low-end board with overall mediocre cooling faculties, we also ran torture tests on the VRM under stock CPU settings. The cooler didn't change VRM thermals in any meaningful way. The V-Core VRM MOSFET measured, for the ones that we tested, measured approximately 55 degrees Celsius in this torture workload, with VSOC measuring about 50 degrees Celsius. We're so far away from thermal derating that it's not even worth worrying about. The caps are fine too, and that's typically what dies because they're rated for, well, you lose a lot of the life every 10 degrees it goes up. So this board gives you plenty of overclocking headroom for the 3000G, and would even reasonably support a CPU upgrade to a 2600 or 3600 in the future. As long as the CPU has sufficient cooling, we'd recommend, for the 3000G anyway, overclocking it as close to 4 GHz as you can get, and for upgrades, we'd recommend leaving them stock. The impact in gaming for the 3000G OC will be noteworthy in most instances. As for the $500 system, keep in mind that we've changed the GPU memory case and cooler, so this is not a like-for-like test, but we're close enough, and we can do a separate review later on these cases if there's interest. CPU thermals show that the Fractal Focus G suffers from poor ventilation and cooling out of box. It could be made better, though. The build quality for a cheap case overall is good, and ease of installation or quality of life features are significantly better than the Zonda O, which feels like a case from 2007. That said, its thermals are embarrassingly bad. We've changed systems, so the results again aren't directly comparable, but we can compare enough to see the problem. This would be worthy of discussion in a separate case review, but looking at the CPU's 85-degree thermal result, and then looking at some B-roll of the front panel of the Focus G, it's clear that Fractal's wannabe mesh is the problem. Fractal has fallen prey to the classic conundrum of double stacking mesh and dust filters, whereupon the dust filter's metal lines up with the mesh's holes rather than hole to hole, effectively creating a solid panel with this arrangement. This can be overcome to some extent to a satisfactory degree at this price point if adding about 2 fans to the front panel, because the stock fans are low static pressure and can't overcome the flow impedance natively. At that point though, you're basically buying a more expensive case. Maybe there's something to the Zonda O after all. If we did this again, we would probably choose something other than the Focus G. There are plenty of other $70-ish cases, so you raise the price floor a bit, but it is much better. But at that point, for a $400 build, it does feel kind of bad. So we'll have to look into more budget cases later. Gaming tests will be split into 2 charts of 3 games for the averages, and then we'll look at the 1% lows separately. We're also adding our 3000G 2080 Ti test from the CPU reviews, which will allow us to determine at what point the Athlon 3000G is bottlenecking the GPU. F1 2018 with our usual 1080p high settings has the $400, well, really it's $371 3000G RX 570 system at 97 FPS average, and the $500 GTX 1650 system at 108 FPS average. That's an improvement of 12% for the $100 that went toward improving the RAM, the GPU, the case, and the cooler. The 2080 Ti, for reference, got throttled by the CPU at 139 FPS average, so we still have room for better GPUs between that and the 1650 Super. Overclocking the 3000G to 4 GHz boosted the ceiling to 152 FPS average, although our budget GPUs are limiting performance in F1 2018 at this point. The 2080 Ti is still clearly bottlenecked though. Hitman 2 is on the same chart. In this one, we see that the CPU bottlenecks us on all 3 configurations. The $371 system and $500 systems have no real change in gaming performance. Both are stuck at around 43 to 44 FPS average. The 2080 Ti system brute forces its way forward in the few GPU-bound spikes that exist, hitting 47 FPS average, and the 4 GHz OC gets us to 50. It'd be worth overclocking the 3000G anyway, but all 3 of these configurations will get stuck on the CPU eventually. For Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we again find a CPU bottleneck. The 3000G limits performance to about 53 FPS average, with one big exception being the overclocked configuration 58 FPS average ceiling. That allows for a 9.4% performance uplift from the CPU overclock alone, which does mean it's worth doing. It also means that the higher-end cooler is worthwhile for anyone considering an overclock on the CPU. For the next gaming chart, GTA 5 is an older title that still manages to become GPU-bound with our mix of very high and ultra settings at 1080p. In this instance, the Athlon 3000G doesn't limit the RX 570, but instead the 570 limits the 3000G. This could be inverted if we reduce graphics settings, of course, but you'd probably want to find a balance between them. The 1650 Super is mostly able to max out the Athlon 3000G here, at which point it's bouncing off of CPU limits. We know this because the 2080 Ti gets stuck at 54 FPS average, illustrating the 1650 Super is near the upper bound for the CPU. Overclocking the CPU allows 11% uplift from the 54 FPS average result. The 570 would limit you here, but could be worked with by reducing graphics settings. Texture settings, for one, would be helpful. For Total War Warhammer 2 battle benchmark, the 3000G is actually bottlenecked on the lower end GPUs, maxing out at 54 FPS average. This is illustrated again by the 2080 Ti, which manages 78 FPS before it hits the CPU bottleneck. Overclocking to 4 GHz allows us to boost from 78 to 88 FPS average, a gain of about 12%. Finally, the campaign benchmark sits at around 55 to 57 FPS average for the lower end builds, with the upper bound shown by the 2080 Ti. Either GPU would be fine for this configuration, barring performance issues within GTA 5 that are at least partially related to VRAM and memory bandwidth. Let's move on to 1% lows. Here's a chart of the first 3 games, but for 1% lows, this represents frame time variability and frame-to-frame consistency. The 4 GHz 3000G and 2080 Ti establish what's possible for the CPU, where we hold a 96 FPS 1% low performance for F1 2018. This is extremely good for the $50 part, but the GPU is carrying a lot of the weight, most of it. The ceiling drops to 61 FPS, 1% lows with a 570. F1 2018 always favors AMD cards for frame times in our GPU reviews, so that carries over here. And it's down to 36 for the 1650 Super. This is an outlier for F1 and shouldn't be factored in too heavily unless playing this game or F1 series games specifically. For Hitman 2, we're in the 16 to 20 range, but this game also has issues with frame time consistency, as discussed many times in the past. Tomb Raider is the best balance of the games here, and overall, we're within error at 30 to 34 FPS 1% lows, even with the 2080 Ti. This next one shows 3 other games. Here, the RX 570 build has the worst 1% lows, except in Total Warhammer's battle benchmark, where they're roughly equal. It performs worse than the $500 build in the campaign benchmark lows and in GTA 5 lows. Predictably, the 2080 Ti shows that much more is possible, but overall, the 1650 Super does a good job of meeting it halfway. Reducing settings would be the best combination for these parts though. Our last gaming benchmark is split aside because it's measured in turn time rather than frame rate. This is mostly a CPU-bound benchmark, but performance does dip with the RX 570 build. Part of that is the RAM, which has been downgraded for cost savings in the cheaper of the two builds. GPU performance also affords some boost, as shown by the 2080 Ti at 73 seconds turn time. Despite being primarily CPU limited, the overclock also gets us to 65 seconds, a noteworthy bump from the 77-second baseline with the 1650 Super. Moving on to the last chart for power consumption, we recorded the average power draw by the system in watts when running game benchmarks and workloads. We typically measure at the EPS 12-volt cables for CPUs or PCIe cables and slots for GPUs, but given that this is a full system build, we're taking total system power. This is useful for determining how much power your power supply should be capable of driving for a build similar to one of these. The $371 build consumed more power on average, which is largely from the GPU change, although the memory change and case fan changes would also impact power consumption to a lesser degree. In gaming workloads with graphics loads, we saw between 160 and 180 watts for the GTX 1650 Super build, so that's the whole computer, which has a more efficient overall build. The RX 570 ran 210 to 250 for gaming workloads altogether, where the lower of these, Civ, is more of a CPU-only workload that isolates some of the work being done. Even if you were to tax both components at 100%, you'd be near or under 300 watts. 500 watts is sufficient to account for the heaviest load scenarios and some minor room to upgrade. Having now been through the entire process of building these budget or ultra-budget systems, there's a few things we would change. And I guess we should talk about upgrades first. One of the first upgrades you could do, not just a change, but an improvement in general, would obviously be an SSD. Going back to hard drives is, it's harder than you might expect if you've been on SSDs, but Windows boot times alone are significantly improved with SSDs, obviously, and also our confidence in an SSD's ability to soak Windows bloat, and it will become bloated whether you are immaculate in your management of the system software or not. Microsoft will make sure it does, but an SSD will cope with that bloating of the OS with age better than a hard drive will, because it's already fast enough that as it slows down, you're less likely to notice a 1 second or a 2 second increase or a 10% slowdown, whereas a hard drive, you will definitely notice a 10% slowdown in boot times. So probably an SSD is one of the best places to invest in improving it. You don't get immediate frame rate or immediate performance. That's why we chose the hard drives, because if you're just focused on maximum frame throughput for the dollar, then you can pull some of that budget from where an SSD would be at about $50 for one that's worth your time. Don't spend too little on one or you get something worse than a hard drive or something that'll die really quickly. And you pull that budget and put it into better GPU or CPU or motherboard, whatever. You could do cheaper motherboards. You drop 20 bucks on the lower on the board, get something that's $50, but you kill any upgrade pathways. It's questionable how long the board will last. There's a very good chance you do have some performance degradation as well. The lookup tables for volt frequency might not be as tuned, so we just don't really recommend it. It makes a lot more sense to spend the extra money on the board and have a platform that isn't, you don't really want to just build a computer, even if it's cheap, that is disposable, because that's what it would be. If you drop the motherboard quality enough, you end up with something that it just gets basically thrown away or given away rather than upgraded. The next thing to consider for an upgrade, so first of all, the CPU cooler and the case are really important. The Fractal Focus G, for example, would be really a terrible choice with the stock cooler, because the stock cooler wouldn't be strong enough to compensate for the Focus G's poor static pressure, and you'd end up running the CPU much too hot. So a decent enough, like $20 CPU cooler could get you pretty far. You might be able to find free ones or close to free ones for, I mean, those types of towers have been around for a couple of years now for original AM4 launch. So it's sort of difficult to say you should spend $20 or $25 on a cooler when that's like almost 7-8% of the whole system cost, or 5% if it's the really cheap, like the $371, $400 build, whatever. But it is important though, and it'll reduce noise and stuff. So I think if I were to do this personally, the way I would change the $371 build would probably be $40 SSD, like an 860 Evo with the cheapest price I could get on capacity, and then maybe a small tower cooler, air cooler, or live with the stock cooler for a few months and upgrade it. My next consideration would definitely be the CPU. I think if you're doing the $100 jump that we had, that $500 build, I think at that point you should probably rework the build, because I'm not super happy with how that one performs for the price. I think what I would do differently there is probably drop the GPU back down to like a 570 that's on sale instead of the 1650 Super, and increase the CPU quality. You can get an R5 2600 for $100 something bucks now. 1600 is pretty cheap as well, depending on where you buy. You can get them new for really in the low hundreds, and that would probably be my third thing I'd really want to try to change. So SSD, probably CPU cooler, and then really trying to push for a low-end CPU upgrade. And we have another content piece coming up on that. The budget's a bit higher on it, but it'll give you a good look at how the older Ryzen chips perform and price for a modern build. So anyway, that's what we changed, and that's how it performed. $370 is really good. You could certainly do cheaper. It's just that we start to feel very uncomfortable as you go cheaper, because now you're moving away from build that will last a while and is upgradable, and into territory of build that will have issues that cost you money in your time to resolve and becomes very frustrating potentially, and also a system that is not really upgradable. So 370 is kind of where we feel decent about it, and otherwise definitely try to do a CPU upgrade and an SSD. Actually, I should note that if you upgrade the CPU, then you don't even really need to buy a cooler, because the like 2600 stock cooler is good enough to last you for a long time without any kind of overclocking. So if you're running at stock, you can eliminate that, just do SSD, CPU upgrade, and then dump the GPU back down a level in the $500 variant. That's probably how I'd redo it if I did it again. Anyway, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly by buying things like our mod mats, or probably when this video goes up, our disappointment PC shirts will be out of stock, but we still have other ones there. And we'll see you all next time.